The morning started like any other Tuesday in Willowbrook subdivision, until Sarah Martinez stepped onto her back porch with her coffee and saw something that made her blood run cold. Where yesterday there had been a gentle creek meandering through her property, the same creek that had flowed for decades before the subdivision was even built, now there was nothing but a wall of fresh concrete, still glistening in the morning sun. Sarah set her mug down with trembling hands and walked closer to inspect the barrier. The concrete was professional work, reinforced with rebar and perfectly sealed. This wasn't some prank or accident. Someone had deliberately dammed her creek overnight, and she had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Jim Patterson, who lived 3 houses down. "Sarah, you need to see this. Karen's posted something in the HOA group chat about unauthorized water features being a liability. She's calling an emergency meeting for tonight." Sarah's jaw clenched as she read the message thread. There it was, in Karen Whitfield's characteristically condescending tone. "As your HOA president, I've taken decisive action to protect our community from potential flooding and mosquito breeding ground. D's, the illegal creek modification on Maple Street has been properly remediated. Homeowners will be billed for the concrete work accordingly." The audacity was breathtaking. Sarah had bought this house specifically because of the creek. It was clearly marked on her property survey, predating the subdivision by at least 50 years. She'd spent 2 years and $15,000 creating a small wetland habitat around it, complete with native plants and a tiny wooden bridge her late husband had built by hand. Her phone rang, and she saw Jim's name on the screen. "Sarah, this is insane." Jim's voice was tight with anger. "That creek doesn't just run through your property. It's part of the natural drainage system for the whole area. My grandfather told me it's been there since the 1940s. She can't just cement over a natural waterway." Sarah replied, though even as she said it, she realized Karen had, in fact, already done exactly that. There have to be environmental regulations, permits required for something like this. You'd think so. But you know Karen. She probably found some loophole, or just decided to deal with the consequences later. She's been gunning for you ever since you refused to take down your bird feeders. That was true. Sarah's conflict with Karen had been brewing for months. It started with complaints about Sarah's unkempt native plant garden, escalated through accusations about her compost bin attracting rats, and reached a fever pitch when Karen demanded Sarah remove the small dock she'd built for her kayak, claiming it was an unauthorized structure. But this was different. This was war. "Jim, I need you to do me a favor," Sarah said, her mind already racing with plans. "Can you take some photos of the concrete work from your side of the property line, and maybe check if you still have those old survey maps your grandfather left you?" "Already ahead of you. I've got photos, and I'm pretty sure I can find those surveys in my attic." "Sarah, what are you thinking?" Sarah looked at the concrete barrier again, noting how hastily it had been constructed despite its professional appearance. Whoever did this work had been in a hurry, focused more on speed than on understanding the broader implications of what they were doing. "I'm thinking Karen may have just made the biggest mistake of her whole presidency," Sarah said quietly. "That creek doesn't just disappear. because she buried it. The water has to go somewhere. That evening, the community center was packed for the emergency HOA meeting. Sarah arrived early and took a seat in the front row, her folder of documents thick in her lap. She'd spent the afternoon on the phone with the county engineering department, the state environmental agency, and a lawyer who specialized in water rights. Karen swept into the room at exactly 7 o'clock. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer blazer projecting an image of unshakable authority. She was flanked by her usual supporters, Ted Morrison, who always agreed with whatever Karen said, and Linda Hayes, whose primary concern seemed to be property values above all else. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed impatience. "We're here tonight to address a serious liability issue that threatened our entire community. Thanks to swift action by your HOA board, we've eliminated an unauthorized water feature that could have resulted in flooding, property damage, and potentially serious legal exposure." Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded calmly over her folder. "Now, I know some of you might have questions about the methods we used," Karen continued, "but I want to assure everyone that we consulted with professionals and took all necessary precautions. The concrete barrier was installed by Mitchell & Sons Construction, and the work was completed to county specifications." That's when Sarah stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The room fell silent. "Karen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed space, "did you obtain permits from the county for this work?" Karen's confident smile faltered just slightly. Permits weren't necessary for remediation work on private property, even for work on a natural waterway that predates the subdivision by 50 years. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah could see doubt creeping into the faces around the room. Karen's recovery was smooth, but Sarah caught the flash of uncertainty in her eyes. "Sarah, I understand you're upset about losing your little pond, but it wasn't a pond, Karen. It was a creek that's been carrying runoff from the hills above us for generations, and now the water has nowhere to go." As if summoned by her words, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the evening sky. 3 days after the HOA meeting, Sarah's prediction began to come true, but not in the way anyone expected. The rain started as a gentle drizzle on Friday evening, the kind of steady precipitation that usually soaked into the ground and fed the local water table without causing any problems. But by Saturday morning, something was clearly wrong in the Willowbrook subdivision. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching water pool in places it had never pooled before. Her own backyard, formerly the lowest point where the creek had naturally channeled water away, was now a small lake. But more troubling was what she could see happening to the streets beyond her property line. Maple Street, the main thoroughfare through their section of the subdivision, was beginning to flood. Water crept up from the storm drains, spreading across the asphalt in sheets that reflected the gray morning sky. By noon, several residents were moving their cars to higher ground. Her phone rang. It was Jim Patterson, and he sounded worried. "Sarah, you need to come look at this. The water's not going anywhere. It's just sitting there, getting deeper." Sarah grabbed her rain jacket and headed outside. The scene that greeted her was surreal. What had been a quiet suburban street yesterday was now resembling a small river. The water was ankle-deep in some places, and she could see more flowing down from the hills above. With nowhere to go now that the creek bed was sealed with concrete, she waded across to Jim's house, where he was standing on his front porch with several other neighbors, all wearing expressions of growing concern. "It's been like this for 2 hours," said Mrs. Chen from the corner house. "My basement's starting to get wet, and I've never had water problems before, mine too," added Bob Rodriguez from across the street. "I called the city, but they said it's not their jurisdiction. Apparently, since we're in an HOA, any drainage issues are our responsibility to sort out." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction. Though she tried not to show it, this was exactly what she'd tried to warn everyone about at the meeting. Natural waterways exist for a reason. They carry water where it needs to go, block them. And the water finds another path, usually one that causes problems for everyone. "Has anyone heard from Karen about this?" Sarah asked. Jim snorted. "Are you kidding? She's probably at her sister's place in Phoenix this weekend. You know she always disappears when there's any real work to be done." But as if summoned by their conversation, Karen's silver BMW came splashing down Maple Street, sending waves onto the sidewalks. She parked in front of the community mailboxes and stepped out. Her designer rain boots, clearly purchased more for fashion than function. Sarah watched as Karen surveyed the flooding with what appeared to be genuine confusion. For the first time since this whole conflict began, the HOA president looked uncertain, even a little lost. "This is just a temporary situation," Karen announced to the gathered neighbors. Though her voice lacked its usual commanding tone, "The drainage system will catch up once the rain stops, Karen," Mrs. Chen said patiently. "The rain's barely drizzling now, and the water's still rising. My husband thinks it might have something to do with that concrete work you had done." Karen's face flushed. The concrete barrier was installed by professionals. "If there are drainage issues, they're unrelated to our community improvement project." Sarah stepped forward, her boots splashing in the standing water. "Karen, that creek carried approximately 200 gallons per minute during normal conditions. In heavy rain, it could handle up to 1,000 gallons per minute. Where do you think all that water is going now?" "The storm drain system can handle it," Karen replied. But Sarah could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. "What storm drain system?" Bob Rodriguez called out. "The storm drains are backing up because they were never designed to handle this volume of water. The creek was the primary drainage for this whole area." As if to emphasize his point, a manhole cover near the intersection began to bubble and overflow, adding even more water to the growing flood. Karen's composure was beginning to crack. "Look, if there are problems with the municipal drainage system, that's not the HOA's fault. We followed all proper procedures when we had that illegal water feature removed." "Illegal according to who?" Sarah asked quietly. "According to our community's standards and safety regulations." Karen shot back. "That creek was a liability and a health hazard. We did what was necessary to protect property values and resident safety. Did you consult with a hydrologist before making that decision?" Sarah pressed. Karen's silence was answer enough. That's when Ted Morrison, Karen's usual supporter, spoke up from behind her. Karen, maybe we should call an emergency contractor to look at this flooding situation. My gosh, is starting to get water in it, and my wife's talking about filing an insurance claim. Sarah saw the moment when the full scope of the problem began to dawn on Karen. Her eyes widened as she looked around at the standing water, the concerned faces of the residents, and the steady stream still flowing down from the hills above with nowhere to go. I'll make some calls, Karen said weakly. We'll get this sorted out. But as she turned to wade back to her car, Sarah called out one more question. Karen, what's the HOA's insurance deductible for flood damage? Karen stopped walking but didn't turn round because Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet morning air. I'm pretty sure every house on the street is going to be filing claims by Monday. And I'm also pretty sure that when the insurance companies investigate, they're going to want to know why someone sealed off the primary drainage system without permits or environmental impact studies. Karen's shoulders sagged slightly, but she continued walking to her car without responding. As the BMW splashed away down the flooded street, Jim Patterson leaned over to Sarah. You know, he said quietly, I'm starting to think you planned this. Somehow, Sarah shook her head, though she couldn't suppress a small smile. I didn't plan anything, Jim. I just understood what would happen when you block a creek that's been carrying water for 50 years. The water doesn't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. What none of them knew yet was that the real crisis was still to come. By Monday morning, Willowbrook's subdivision looked like a disaster zone. The weekend's light rain had been followed by a more serious storm system that dumped 3 inches in 6 hours, not an unusual out for their region, but devastating when there was no natural drainage to carry it away. Sarah's house, ironically, had suffered the least damage. Built on the original creek bank, it sat on higher ground, and her basement stayed dry while her neighbors dealt with everything from soggy carpets to ruined water heaters. The emergency HOA meeting that Monday night was unlike anything the community had ever seen. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with residents spilling into the hallway and several people participating by phone. The air was thick with tension, anger, and the faint smell of damp carpet that seemed to follow everyone who'd spent the weekend dealing with flood damage. Karen arrived late, looking haggard and defensive. Gone was the polished authority she usually projected. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and her usually perfect makeup looked hurried. She took her place at the front table with visible reluctance. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I know everyone has concerns about the recent weather-related flooding. Weather-related? The interruption came from Ted Morrison. Of all people, Karen's former staunchest supporter. Karen, this has nothing to do with the weather. My basement flooded for the first time in 15 years. And according to my insurance company, they're not covering it because it's the result of intentional modifications to natural drainage systems. A murmur of angry agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah remained quiet in her front row seat, watching the drama unfold with careful attention. Linda Hayes, the other member of Karen's inner circle, spoke up next. I got the same response from my insurance company. They're calling it an unnatural flood and denying all claims related to the basement damage. Karen's face was growing paler by the minute. I've been in contact with Mitchell & Sons Construction, and they assure me that their work was completed to all applicable standards. What standards? Bob Rodriguez stood up, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 3 days pumping water out of his house. Did you get permits for this work? Did you consult with a county engineer? Did you do any kind of environmental impact assessment? Karen's silence stretched uncomfortably long. Mrs. Chen, usually the most diplomatic person in the room, stood up next. Karen, I need a straight answer. Did the HOA obtain proper permits before sealing that creek? The work was done on private property within the subdivision, Karen said weakly. We consulted with our attorney, and he advised us that permits weren't required for improvements within HOA jurisdiction. That's when Sarah finally spoke up. Karen, which attorney did you consult? Our regular HOA attorney, David Brennan. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a document. That's interesting, because I spoke with David Brennan this afternoon. He told me he specifically advised against any modifications to the creek without proper environmental assessments and county permits. He said he sent you an email outlining the potential legal and financial risks. The room fell completely silent. Karen's face went from pale to ashen. He also mentioned, Sarah continued, her voice calm and measured, that you never responded to that email, and that the next thing he heard about the situation was when residents started calling him about flood damage. Jim Patterson leaned forward in his seat. Karen, are you telling us you ignored legal advice and went ahead with this project anyway? Karen's voice came out as barely a whisper. There was a miscommunication about the legal requirements. A miscommunication that's going to cost every family on this street thousands of dollars in repairs. Ted Morrison's anger was building. Karen, my daughter's bedroom was flooded. Her computer, her books, her clothes, everything's ruined, and now you're telling us this was all preventable. That's when Linda Hayes delivered the blow that would ultimately end Karen's tenure as HOA president. Karen, she said, her voice cold with betrayal. I've been doing some research into HOA liability insurance. Our policy specifically excludes coverage for damages resulting from unauthorized modifications to natural features or drainage systems. If residents can't get compensation from their homeowner's insurance, they're going to sue the HOA, and if the HOA is found liable for damages resulting from unauthorized work, our insurance won't cover it. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah could see the math calculating behind the eyes of every person in the room. Flood damage repairs, legal fees, insurance deductibles. Property value impacts it was potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, and the HOA's insurance wouldn't pay a penny of it. How much? Mrs. Chen asked quietly. Linda consulted her notes with the air of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. I've gotten preliminary estimates from 3 restoration companies. For the houses with basement flooding, we're looking at an average of $15,000 per house for proper remediation and repairs. That's just for the homes on Maple Street. How many houses? Bob Rodriguez asked, though Sarah could tell he already knew the answer. 23 houses with confirmed basement flooding. Several more with foundation issues that won't show up for months. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah did the math along with everyone else. 15,000 times 23 was nearly $350,000. And that didn't include the cost of fixing the drainage problem itself. Karen seemed to shrink in her chair as the full scope of the disaster became clear. We could take out a special assessment loan to cover the immediate repairs, she said weakly. A loan secured by what? Ted Morrison demanded. The HOA doesn't have any assets except the community center. And that's not worth a quarter of what we're looking at in damages. Jim Patterson stood up, his voice carrying a finality that everyone recognized. I call for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board and an immediate special election. The motion was seconded so quickly that Sarah couldn't even tell who spoke first. The vote was unanimous except for Karen's abstention. As the meeting dissolved into clusters of residents discussing legal options and repair strategies, Karen sat alone at the front table, staring at her hands. Sarah watched her for a moment, feeling an unexpected pang of sympathy despite everything that had happened. But then she remembered the concrete barrier in her backyard, and the way Karen had dismissed her concerns, and the sympathy faded. The real question now was what they were going to do about the $250,000 disaster that Karen's stubbornness had created. And Sarah had a feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of them. What would you have done if you were facing hundreds of thousands in flood damage because someone in authority ignored expert advocacy and sealed off your community's natural drainage system? 2 months after the flooding, Sarah stood in her backyard watching a crew from Morrison Environmental Services carefully remove the concrete barrier from her creek. The irony wasn't lost on her that Ted Morrison, Karen's former supporter, had started his own environmental remediation company largely in response to the mess the HOA had created. The creek restoration was the final piece of a comprehensive solution that had taken weeks of negotiation, legal maneuvering, and community cooperation to put together. Sarah had played a central role in developing the plan, but the real work had been done by the entire community coming together to fix what Karen's stubbornness had broken. Sarah, can you come take a look at this? Ted called from the creek bed, where his crew was carefully removing the last chunks of concrete. I think we found something interesting. Sarah walked over to see what he was pointing at. Embedded in the concrete were several pieces of rebar and what looked like fragments of old pipe. This wasn't just a simple dam, Ted explained, brushing mud off a piece of the debris. Whoever did this work tried to reroute the creek through some kind of underground pipe system. See these PVC fragments? They were trying to force all the water through a 6-inch pipe. Jim Patterson, who had become the interim HOA president after Karen's resignation, joined them at the creek bank. No wonder the flooding was so bad. They weren't just blocking the creek, they were trying to squeeze a river through a drinking straw. The full scope of Karen's mismanagement had become clear during the legal discovery process that followed the flood damage. Not only had she failed to obtain proper permits, But she had also hired the cheapest contractors she could find without checking their qualifications or insurance coverage. Mitchell and Sons Construction, it turned out, specialized in driveways and sidewalks, with no experience in water management or environmental remediation. Even worse, Karen had signed a contract with a liability waiver that absolved the contractor of responsibility for any unforeseen consequences of their work. When residents tried to sue Mitchell and Sons for the flood damage, they discovered that the company had dissolved and reformed under a new name within days of completing the creek project. The legal battle that followed had been complex and expensive, but ultimately successful. Sarah's meticulous documentation of the environmental impact, combined with expert testimony from hydrologists and environmental engineers, had established clear liability on the part of the HOA for the flood damage. Karen herself had faced both civil and criminal charges. The civil suit was settled out of court when it was discovered that she had personally profited from the concrete project through a kickback arrangement with the contractor. The criminal charges for environmental damage and fraud were still pending, but Karen had already moved out of the subdivision and sold her house at a significant loss. Sarah, Jim said, pulling her back to the present, "I know you've been asked this before, but the new board really hopes you'll consider running for HOA president in the permanent election next month." Sarah shook her head with a small smile. "Thanks, Jim, but I think I've had enough of HOA politics for one lifetime. Besides, you're doing a great job as interim president." The cleanup and restoration had been funded through a combination of sources that Sarah had helped organize. The HOA's special assessment covered about half the costs, financed through a loan secured by future dues increases. Insurance settlements, after extensive legal pressure, covered another 30%. The remainder came from a state environmental remediation grant that Sarah had helped the community apply for, based on the ecological damage caused by the illegal creek modification. The total cost, including flood damage repairs, legal fees, and creek restoration, had come to just over $300,000, almost exactly what Sarah had predicted during that first emergency meeting. But the community had survived, and in many ways had emerged stronger than before. Ted's crew finished removing the last of the concrete, and Sarah watched as the creek began to flow freely for the first time in months. The water was clear and cold, carrying with it small leaves and twigs that had been backed up behind the barrier. Within minutes, the level in her backyard began to drop as the natural drainage pattern reasserted itself. "It's going to take a while for the ecosystem to fully recover," Ted said, wiping his hands on a rag. "But the water table should stabilize within a few weeks, and by next spring you should start seeing the native plants coming back." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched the water flow. The creek looked smaller than she remembered. Months of backup had carved the banks wider, but it was alive again, serving its ancient purpose of carrying mountain runoff safely to the valley below. Mrs. Chen appeared at the fence between their properties, carrying a plate of homemade cookies. "I wanted to thank you again, Sarah. If you hadn't stood up to Karen from the beginning, this could have been so much worse." "We all stood up to her in the end," Sarah replied, accepting a cookie gratefully. That's what it took to fix this. Jim checked his watch and gathered his papers. I better get going. The new board meeting starts in an hour, and we've got the final restoration reports to review. As the work crew packed up their equipment and the neighbors drifted back to their houses, Sarah found herself alone by the creek for the first time since the crisis began. The water gurgled softly over the rocks, and she could hear birds calling from the trees along the bank. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a brief note. "Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that you were right about the creek. I'm sorry for all the trouble I caused." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies came too late to matter, and some lessons were too expensive to forgive easily. But as she watched the creek flow peacefully through her backyard, carrying away the last traces of the concrete and debris that had blocked it for so long, Sarah felt something that had been missing for months. Peace. The crisis was over. The community had learned hard lessons about leadership, environmental responsibility, and the importance of listening to experts before making irreversible decisions. Property values were already recovering, and several new families were moving into houses that had been damaged and renovated with modern flood-resistant features. Most importantly, the creek was free again, doing what it had done for generations, quietly, efficiently carrying water where it needed to go, preventing floods, rather than causing them. Sarah picked up her coffee mug from the porch railing and went inside, leaving the creek to its work. Outside, the water flowed on, indifferent to human politics and power struggles, following the ancient laws of gravity and geology that no HOA board could ever overturn. The restoration was complete. But the real victory wasn't in the creek flowing freely again. It was in a community that had learned to value expertise over authority, cooperation over conflict, and natural systems over artificial control. What would you have done when faced with a leader who prioritized power over common sense and whose mistakes cost the entire community hundreds of thousands of dollars? Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight for the things that can't fight for themselves, like a creek that had been flowing peacefully for 50 years before anyone thought to build a subdivision around it. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Headache Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.